The Tall Grasses Caravanserai, Fire Day Evening, First Week of Autumn, 4718. The previous day, Grand Duke Renjana had listened intently as Aurelius, Diyanah, Marius, and Demi had laid out their case. His expression had remained stoic, betraying little of what he might be thinking. But when they finished, he nodded, his decision made. With a word, he ordered his captains to ready the troops. The large encampment stirred to life, soldiers breaking down tents and loading supplies onto wagons. By midday, the Grand Duke's company was on the move, their march a slow, deliberate advance across the dry plains. They could not make the march in a single day, and halfway there they stopped to make camp, unloading supplies quickly, resting through the night, and then resuming the march on the Fire Day morning. When they finally reached the caravanserai known as Tall Grasses, it was late evening on Fire Day. Renjana ordered his forces to halt. They set up camp 100 feet from its walls, their banners fluttering in the wind as the soldiers prepared for both a longer stop and for the possibility of combat. Aurelius, Diyanah, Marius, and Demi gathered in the center of the camp. With Diyanah was the war lion Raja, whom he had befriended 2 days ago, and who was technically still under the effects of the charm spell that Demi had placed upon it. For some of the march, Anlel had joined them, teaching Diyanah how to care for the lion, but towards the end of the Oath Day ride she had chosen to return to Yanmas, where Sepsinia and Goethe and some of their other allies had remained behind to unpetrify the victims of the Medusa, including their closest ally Rankle. Together they reflected on how wild it was that they had arrived in Yanmas on the Sunday, and so it had been only a week that had transpired, and they had killed Sackles, met a psychopomp, fought a Medusa, and much, much more. Diyanah ruffled Raja's scruffy mane. They had even made many new friends. In the midst of this, Rankle reached out to them via a sending spell. He was all right. So was Eutropia's agent, Sir Mayor Drativis, and the other soldiers they had found in the Medusa's den. Goethe had found some clerics able to reverse the magic. Rankle apologized for not being able to join them for the siege of the caravanserai, but if it looked like it would last longer than a few days, he would ride out to meet them there. Aurelius suggested Rankle and the others do some public relations work with the Duke and the Mercantile Council to spread the good word of Eutropia's agents, and how close they were to solving all of the city's problems, and how they had, true to their word, pretty much wrapped everything up in a week. Rankle agreed, and said he was looking forward to seeing the rest of them on their return. Then Broyce came out of his tent, mounted up on his horse, and requested that Demi and her friends from the Tandak prefecture join him, because he was about to address the mutineers. Grand Duke Broyce Renjana rode out with them, along with some of his most elite allies, including his son and his cleric of Shaylin. They reached a high promontory with a clear view of the caravanserai. He called on his priestess to amplify his voice. "I call on Commander Jalessa Stoble to present herself," he barked across the plains, "and answer for her crimes." On the upper level of the caravanserai something moved. From below a canopied arch it came. It was quite large, and it was sleek and long with serpentile scales of burnt orange. The party had already seen one of these before. It was a desert drake. A woman with dark curly hair was saddled on its back. Behind her was another younger figure. The drake rider must have been Commander Jalessa. Jalessa launched her drake off the second level of the caravanserai, and landed it about 70 or 80 feet from Duke Renjana and his riders. "Grand Duke," she called, "ever have I deferred to your authority. Now, however, I must answer to a higher one." "There is no higher authority for you in my land." "Grand Strategos Maxilla Pytherius calls on me," she claimed triumphantly. "Grand Strategos he might be," called back Renjana, "but Grand Prince he is not. Your regiment is assigned to the prefecture. It answers to me. Your duty is to protect Yanmas, not prey on its merchants. Stand down." "But I have the Grand Prince right here, my lord," she said, leaning slightly to the side on her saddle. A frightened young man with a simple crown was seated behind her. "Behold, Prince Carius Stavian, soon to be Grand Prince Stavian IV, true heir of the kingdom by right of primogeniture, and resurrected in our hour of need. And as for Grand Strategos Maxillar Pytherius, you may ask him about his commands yourself. When his army arrives here on the morrow, he is eager to discuss the future of Taldor with you, Grand Duke." Diyanah noticed something curious about the young man. Carius had died when he was 8. Diyanah had carried him until he was 25, but the resurrected Carius was neither 8 nor 25. He looked maybe 16 or 17 years old. It was as if the years the spirit had spent trapped inside him had aged him at half the normal speed. "Preposterous! Carius died years ago," Grand Duke Renjana proclaimed. "Don't believe me," said Jalessa. "Look to your friends. Or did they not tell you what the purpose of the Church of Twilight was? Why, to bring forth the Twilight Child, who would usher us out of this moment of darkness. Grand Duke Renjana risked an indignant look at Aurelius and Demi and the others, expecting to see in their faces the same utter bewilderment that he was feeling. But then, when he looked at their faces, he saw something different, a nervous energy, something they had been dreading, perhaps. "Is this true?" he suddenly asked Demi. "Why didn't you tell me any of this?" Demi sighed. She didn't wish to lie further. "We knew what the Twilight cult was up to," she said hesitantly. "We didn't know they'd succeed." Even at this distance they could see the strange delight play out on Jalliessa Stoble's face while the Grand Duke struggled with this new information. "While you struggle to understand the implications of this," called Jalliessa, "let me explain how things are now. I have with me the rightful Grand Prince, the one who could unify Taldor, the one who can bring peace. If your army attacks this caravanserai, I will kill him, and instead of having peace, you shall have a bloody war, and all of Taldor will suffer. But it will be for naught, because Grand Strategos Maxilla Pytherius will win anyway, in time. So better to wait and parley and have peace. Now we await his arrival." And with this, Jalliessa's drake took off, lifting into the sky and flying into its den on the upper level of the caravanserai. "We have to take the caravanserai now," urged Diyanah forcefully. "I'm telling you, that's not really the Grand Prince's son. That's some kind of abomination they made." "No," said the Grand Duke forcefully. "You listen here, you southern lord. What she said is right. I will not be the thing that brings death and ruin to Taldor. You all lied to me. You all lied to my face, and now here we are at an impasse, and all of Taldor may suffer for it." "We didn't mean to lie," began Aurelius. "A lie by omission is still a lie," he shouted. He was clearly fuming. He turned his horse around and rode it back to camp. As they reached the camp, the Grand Duke dismounted and made his way to the master tent. "Byron, Patrina, with me. We must deliberate." Demi called after him. "Please, give us a chance to explain ourselves, and to work with you to resolve the situation." He turned around with a start. "Oh yes, and give me one reason why I should trust you, Demi." "Because we killed the Sackles, and we rescued your captain from the Medusa and depetrified him, and we found out where your regiment went, and because the Falspars and the Renjanas have been allies for centuries, and because though I made a mistake here, and I know that, but despite that one error in judgment, I think you know you can still trust us." The Grand Duke let out a frustrated cry and said, "Fine, fine, come into the war tent, but I will have no more secrets from any of you." The company gathered in the Duke's tent, and Diyanah pulled from his bag a fine bottle of Frascati Red, which he poured for the Grand Duke. "This will help cooler heads prevail," he said. The Grand Duke sighed. "I must admit your family does make very good wine, Lord Frascati, but I'm not sure that will be sufficient to smooth over this evening's debacle." Aurelius tried his hand at diplomacy here. "Let us try and explain why we didn't reveal this, just so you understand our position. We are in service to Princess Eutropia, you see? And you didn't want another, perhaps more valid heir to become known," chided the Grand Duke. "No, it was nothing like that. We didn't tell Princess Eutropia about this possibility because she already grieved her brother years ago. We were worried that what the Twilight Church was doing in trying to resurrect Carius would rattle her, so we didn't want to tell her until we knew for sure, and now we do, and we couldn't tell you because we'd already decided not to tell her. Anyway, it doesn't matter. If we had told you or not, don't you see what Pytherius is?" "Yes, I must admit the Pytherius I knew wouldn't order our soldiers to prey on our citizens." "I'm guessing you didn't think you would resurrect a long-dead child and then use the child to try to seize power either," said Aurelius. "He's not the straightforward military man he presents. He's manipulative, he can be quite cruel, but most importantly, he'll stop at nothing for power." "Let's say you've convinced me, Baron. What would you have me do? You've heard her, and I believe her. Pytherius went quiet weeks ago. I have no doubt now that he's been marching an army across the Whistling Plains. His forces have gone around the other side of the World's Edge Mountains. If anything happens to the boy, he'll have no choice but to attack, and he'll attack here. He'll attack my prefecture. He'll overpower me if he's got his full army. My house guard won't be enough to hold the line. Who knows how many soldiers he's bringing with him from the south." "And if he does get that boy," said Diyanah, "and if everyone reacts like you did because we're Taldans and we love tradition, if people think he controls the rightful heir, then that's even worse because he just wins automatically. Obviously, in that scenario, it's better to fight, right?" "There's an alternative," said Aurelius. "We don't risk a direct confrontation with Pytherius. In fact, we can retreat if we need to tomorrow, but what we do right now is we wait until nightfall, and then we kidnap Prince Carius. If we have the prince, then we control the heir, and in time the other Grand Dukes can be moved against Pytherius." "And how do you propose you take the boy without the commander killing him?" asked the Grand Duke. "Not with an army. With 4 experts, invisible, silenced, who have done this type of thing in the past." The Grand Duke sighed deeply. "I assume by 4 experts you're referring to yourselves." "And possibly a lion," suggested Diyanah. "I can't believe I'm agreeing to this," said the Grand Duke. "But all right. You have to promise me you won't kill the child, though. I can't afford to have my whole prefecture become a killing field." The Tall Grasses Caravanserai, Fire Day night, first week of autumn, 4718. The party had decided that the most likely place for Carius to be hidden would be near the Drake's Den on the upper level of the Caravanserai. That's also where they assumed they'd be most likely to find Commander Jalyessa Stobel as well. They used their usual stealth mission set of spells. Aurelius cloaked them with invisibility, Demi silenced them. Then Diyanah slammed his magic standard against the floor, and suddenly and silently they were teleported to the top floor of the Caravanserai. This was an aerial stable. Much of the southern wall was open to the elements, with only a low railing to prevent anyone from falling into the courtyard below. The west side of the room contained bedding made of dead grass and torn tablecloths, and the room had a sharp reptilian reek. Slumbering peacefully on its bedding was Jalyessa's desert drake. Marius approached stealthily, popping the blade on Coriana's fist and delivering a terrible and sudden coup de grace to the sleeping drake. Despite the size of the beast, Marius and the ancient relic weapon were able to end the life of the great beast suddenly and very quickly. Diyanah at this point let the large invisible lion that he'd brought with him eat hungrily of the dead beast. Interestingly, eating the dead did not break the invisibility spell. This attack broke Marius out of the invisibility sphere, however, so Aurelius tagged him with a greater invisibility spell. This would allow him to fight without breaking stealth, but it also meant they had to move quickly. He opened a north-facing door, and saw to his left some stairs leading down, so he knew he had to go to the right. He followed the corridor around until he saw another door, which he carefully opened. It was, as they had suspected, the commander's office. The north wall of this once opulent office contained a massive bookshelf, filled with carefully folded maps, ledgers, and scroll tubes. A large desk filled the southern half of this room, with a chair of battered but neatly repaired leather. At the other end of the room was another door that likely led to Jalyessa's sleeping quarters. The only item that seemed out of place in the office was a pallet of straw and grass in an alcove to the south, upon which slept a large ram. Marius recalled that Jalyessa was a druid of sorts, so it was possible the ram was her animal companion. He disliked killing animals as much as Demi did, but he worried the ram might issue an alarm, so he approached quietly, and just as quickly as he had with the drake, he ended its life. Then he opened the door. Jalyessa was not sleeping, she had been reading a book. She looked nervous and panicked as the door opened, and nothing appeared to come in. She reached for a magical spear that rested by the side wall of her bedroom, but Marius moved faster, leaping onto the bed. The silent spell made their struggle inaudible, beyond the confines of the room, and soon enough Marius had killed her as well. The party looked around the office. No sign of Carius anywhere. "Damn it," said Aurelius. "I was really hoping it would be that easy." Demi spotted something. "Hey, isn't that the crown that she had put on Carius's head?" The party agreed that they thought it might be. "Okay, I have an idea then," she said, and Demi went over to Raja. "Hey boy, can you smell this crown? Can you smell the scent on the crown? Do you think you can follow it?" The lion sniffed at the crown, and then sniffed at the ground. It seemed to have found the scent. "Oh, I see, I knew it was a good call to bring Raja here," declared Diyanah. Marius's greater invisibility spell had already worn off, so now Marius had to cast a regular invisibility spell on him. The wizard definitely felt like he was burning all his spells just keeping the party hidden. They followed Raja down the northern stairs, stealthily past a patrol of archers that were watching out the west walls, and then they continued to follow the invisible lion down into the common room, which was empty at night. Under the Caravanserai's great onion dome was a large mess hall, and on one side of the hall a set of curved stairs leading down into a dungeon below. "Of course this place has a dungeon underneath it," moaned Aurelius. "Okay, be ready for anything, everyone." Marius led the way as the group descended the narrow stone steps, their footfalls uncomfortably audible as they went, knowing they had to trust in Demi's magic to keep that sound from traveling. The air grew damp and heavy as they moved deeper into the dungeon beneath the Caravanserai. The flickering light of oil lamps on the walls here seemed to cast eerie shadows on the rough stone walls. At the base of the stairs they found themselves in a dank chamber. It was not empty. 2 dwarven monks, wearing the blue robes of the Twilight cult, the trim on their robes decorated with many interlacing circles, were guarding the hall here, despite the late hour. Within the room, a short flight of steps led up to a sturdy door, its thick wooden surface marred with deep gouges, as if someone or something had tried to force its way out at some point. The door was set squarely in the center of the wall. Demi's keen eyes noted that figures appeared to be moving on the other side of the arrow slits. Even without the two dwarf guards, this place could be a death trap. On the other side of the wall from the door, a heavy portcullis blocked the way, its iron bars thick and unyielding, and the portcullis itself was rusted, as if it had not been moved in years. Diyanah looked over the two monks, and he spotted a silver disc on their lapel, etched with an elaborate Vudrani crown. This was the holy symbol of Raumia, a god not widely worshipped in the Inner Sea region, but who, according to Irori's holy texts, had attempted to thwart Irori's ascension to godhood at multiple times. Diyanah's face contorted into a snarl. The Immaculate Circle, or the Twilight Cult, or whatever they're calling themselves now, really is a who's who of terrible people. These are monks of Raumia, evil bastards. But they are monks, and they'll notice if we try to sneak by them. From here on out, I think we're going to have to fight. Watch out for their trips. Diyanah leapt forward, the invisibility fading as he delivered a flaming, spinning kick to the first of the three monks. Initially startled, the monks reacted with expected swiftness. Where Diyanah had become a master of the dragon style, the dwarven monks had instead studied the mantis style, which had taught them how to target vital areas with crippling accuracy, but also to deliver dangerous sweeping attacks, coupled with opportunistic and vicious stomps to downed enemies. Marius discovered this the hard way, when he came up behind Diyanah and tried to punch one of the two monks, only to see his blow deflected, a sharp punch to the stomach wind him, and then a sweep of the legs knock him to the floor. Before he could even get his bearings, a swift crack followed, as the monk delivered a vicious kick to the head. "I told you to watch out for their trips," chided Diyanah as Marius went down. Fortunately, Marius's foe was distracted when a previously invisible lion suddenly bounded into the room, roaring and snarling wildly and gripping the surprised dwarven monk with its vice-like jaws. Demi stepped in close to Marius to get in range of the silent table spell, and then began to sing softly, energizing the allies closest to her. Even Raja was affected by her powerful song magic. She drew Dignity's barb and took aim at the monk fighting Diyanah. As the skirmish broke out, the archers on the other side of the door, behind the arrow slits, began to fire into the kill zone. Fortunately, Diyanah was able to deflect one of the arrows as it came screaming at him, thanks to his uncanny monk reflexes. Marius, prone as he was, almost took an arrow to the torso as well. But the magic of Dignity's barb pulled Demi's attention. She pulled the trigger and literally shot the arrow out of the air before it struck Marius. "You're welcome," she said with a cocky wink. Aurelius came down last, waiting for everyone to be distracted, and using his face in the crowd ability to appear unnoteworthy in the chaos. He had a solution, but he needed Demi's help. "I'm going to summon something in to kill the archers behind the arrow slits, but I need you to silence it or we risk drawing the attention of everyone in the dungeon." Demi nodded at him that she was ready. Aurelius flicked his fingers and cast a conjuration spell. Suddenly, on the other side of the arrow slits, there was a massive bear. Demi's eyes widened with surprise, but she knew what to do. She enchanted it with a silent table, and now it was a massive silenced bear, making no noise as it clawed its way happily through the poor archers on the other side. For good measure, Aurelius also chucked his familiar figurine through the crack in the door, and then awoke it into full eagle size on the other side, where it began to peck and caw silently at the archers. Marius staggered up to his feet. "When did we start bringing an entire zoo with us to our fights?" "Yeah, seriously," said Demi. "I'm jealous now. It seems like everyone has an animal other than me." Raja had completely torn apart the monk he was fighting. The monk Diyanah was fighting looked over in alarm and focused on his chi. Suddenly he was gone. "Oh, this is bad," said Diyanah. "They know the way of the abundant steppe. They can teleport. He's probably gone to grab reinforcements." Behind the door there was a fluttering of wings, and then suddenly the heavy oak door swung open. Rodrigo, it seemed, had pulled the right lever. Diyanah ran into the adjoining guardroom. Beyond was a scene of carnage. The bear had run wildly through the hall, chomping archers as it went. Fortunately, the other monk had not gone far. It was just down this hall where a short bell was mounted on the wall, and the monk was pulling on the rope, clanging it with all his might. Diyanah breathed a sigh of relief. The monk had not realized the bear was under the effect of a silent table spell, and he was within 10 feet of the bear. While he was clanging the bell as hard as he could, from where Diyanah was standing, he could hardly hear it. Diyanah ran forward and delivered a final smashing blow to the monk, rendering it unconscious and out of the fight. The party took a breather. The summoned bear faded from the world. From here on out, there would be no more invisibility, as Aurelius was running low on spells, But sound control was still going to be important, so they would need to keep moving to preserve Demi's silent spells. Apart from the heavy wooden door that they had just come through, along with a row of arrow slits that looked out over the landing of the stairs, the long narrow guardroom had little of interest. An iron lever set in the northwest corner to open the door, and a large bell with a pull rope to sound the alarm. For good measure, Diyanah cut the clapper out of the bell and dropped it on the floor, and then he dismounted the whole bell and stuck it in his bag of holding just in case anyone else came by here. Beyond the bell there was a door to the right, and a set of double doors to the left. Instinctively following Aurelius's left-hand rule, Marius, who still being the target of the silent spell led the way, followed the double doors into a cavernous chamber. This large natural cave had been widened by excavation. Masonry walls enclosed structures within the cave, including what looked like a temple to the south and a crypt to the north. At the very southern end, a low stone wall enclosed a large pool of water or cistern. In the crypt, the ancient stone door opened into a dusty old room filled with 5 stone sepulchres, each carved with the likeness of a man or woman and decorated with a large brass circle. One large sepulchre lay beyond the first 5 to the east, its lid secured with iron bands. Aurelius stepped into the room and cast the detect magic spell, looking for any unpilfered gear. "I detect no magic," said Aurelius. "It's possible the sepulchres are blocking the spell, but let's just err on the side of caution and move on. Disturbing tombs never goes well." The party gingerly moved past this room and checked the temple instead. Inside, rows of pews and a stone altar on a low dais made it clear that this room was a shrine. A large statue of a mysterious hooded figure stood solemn vigil at the east end. Spirals and overlapping circles of various sizes had been drawn on the walls in blue and yellow paint. Demi's now extensive research into the Sackles allowed her to recognize the figure of the statue. It was one of the Sackil tormentors, those most powerful of Sackils that had acquired a sliver of dark divinity, the great horrors among their kind. This one was called Velgas, the Mind in the Dark, an evil deity of corruption, emptiness, and ignorance, a strange entity for any cult to revere. Yet cultists he evidently had, wearing blue robes covered in intersecting silver circles and brandishing wicked barbed sickles. A half-dozen cultists were seated in the pews before the altar. They looked up in surprise as Marius opened the door and stepped into the room. In moments the party was upon the cultists, Marius chopping with Coriana's blade, Diyanah swinging his fist, Demi firing her crossbow, Raja charging in with claw and fang, and Aurelius countering the magical attacks of the cultists with his mastery of arcana. Only one of the cultists managed to react fast enough to fire an arcing bolt of lightning down the line of heroes, but they evaded the worst of the blast, and soon he too was dead. Marius retracted the blade on Coriana's fist, and with a single powerful punch of the gauntlet he shattered the statue of Velgas. No sense in leaving such a profane idol intact, he thought. Adjoining with the temple was another smaller room. Marius entered it to find a curious sight. This was a dressing room, containing only a vanity table and a single wooden chair. The vanity table contained a large mirror, ringed with candles burning brightly. An overstuffed sewing basket sat on the vanity table, with needles and thread of many types, and colors spilling out over the basket's top. A single, gangly creature sat in the chair before the vanity, using the sewing kit to slowly stitch its turban to its head and its veil to its face. It turned slowly around and gave them a creepy look with its half-covered face. "This thing is a denizen of Leng," said Demi. "It comes from a place where the dimension of dreams abuts with a dark tapestry. I don't know what it's doing here, but it's quite powerful. Maybe don't go in swinging right away." "Who are you?" asked Marius. "Oh, good," said the creature. "I had worried that like all foolish adventurers you'd rush in here swinging your swords, and I'd have to kill you all. So glad you'd rather converse like civilized beings. I have no desire to fight you at all. I am called the Placid One." "And what are you doing here beneath the caravanserai?" "I'm transacting a deal with the Nephilim," he said plainly. "But I'm not one of his, as you might say, minions." "We are likely to confront this Nephilim," said Marius. "Will you stand in our way?" "My deal is not to protect him," said the Placid One. Then after a pause he added, "Let me make this very simple," and he drew forth a colorful ruby from his yellow robes. "I will offer you this rare Leng ruby, almost priceless, if you understood its true nature, simply to leave me alone." Diyanah liked the look of the ruby. "Deal," he said, and he stepped forward, and he took the ruby from the creature. "You just stay here and keep putting your hat on. Don't mind us." He pulled Marius back out of the room and closed it behind him. Marius gave him a nervous glance. "Aren't you the least bit suspicious about that ruby?" he said. "Who cares?" said Diyanah. "It's going in the bag of holding where it can't harm me, and we'll sell it later for a bunch of cool gear. Let's keep moving." Marius frowned slightly, but he pressed on. They didn't have time for endless debate. The minutes on Demi's silent spell were ticking away. He did not, however, notice that Diyanah didn't place the ruby in the bag of holding. He placed it instead in his pocket. Beyond another set of double doors lay a long hallway. To the left along the hallway, a small room that looked like an alchemical disposal chamber was located. At the center of this room was a pit that had sides slick with stains, scarred and grooved as well, as though with acid. Cells lined the outer walls. Here Marius narrowly avoided a pit trap that attempted to drop him into a pit in the center, in which a wet black pudding oozed and dissolved refuse. He promptly closed the door behind him. A small chamber to the right looked like a couple's personal chamber. A comfortable bed stood in the southwest corner. Several small keepsakes, including a couple of small leather journals, cluttered the wall shelves. Flipping through the journals, it became clear this room had once been occupied by Jaundice and Fathery Stoble, suggesting that the two of them were closer with the Twilight cult than had been the other soldiers. Across from this was a room that appeared to be a kitchen of some kind, with 2 additional doors that led into other rooms. The party closed this door and proceeded. As they moved on beyond this room, at the end of the hallway they caught sight of a titanic guardian that was patrolling the long hallway, a clay golem, resembling a squat humanoid with blunt bare features. As soon as it saw them in the hall, it surged forward, thrashing its heavy arms at Marius. Marius absorbed the brunt of this attack by raising his shield. Aurelius knew well that golems were either immune or highly resistant to magical spells and attacks, so the trick with golems was conjuration spells that created physical substances for the golem to interact with. Additionally, golems were not particularly dexterous creatures, so he cast a grease spell, and though it was a relatively low-level spell, it did the trick. The golem collapsed in a heap, and Marius was able to batter it down with his gauntlet, opting for battering strikes without the blade, rather than slashing cuts with a punch dagger. Unfortunately, in the midst of all this, Demi's silent spell wore off, and the death rattles of the golem began to alert other denizens of the dungeon in the adjoining room. From a set of double doors to the left, a dwarven alchemist appeared, wearing the circular imagery of the cult. Behind her was a strange ghostly leopard that she appeared to be commanding. Then, skittering from a room even further down the corridor, a quartet of were-rats in hybrid form came lunging towards them. This was no longer the time for stealth. The heroes battled with everything they had in them. Aurelius cast a haste spell, Demi sang, and Marius, Diyanah, and Raja battered their foes up close. Although the battle was going in their favor, all the commotion soon woke up a handful of soldiers stationed in an adjoining barracks. They had not heard the fight with the golem, but they were hearing the battle with the dwarf and the rats. The biggest problem was positioning. The soldiers were coming through from a door that was close to where Demi and Aurelius were providing support to the frontline warriors, meaning that they were suddenly exposed and vulnerable. Just before a sword stroke could strike at Demi, though, Aurelius grabbed her and cast a dimension door spell, putting them on the other side of the were-rats and at a safe distance from the soldiers. With the 2 spellcasters gone, the soldiers advanced towards Marius's exposed flank. Only Raja had finished mauling the dwarf, and his non-magical attacks were having no effect on the phantom leopard, so it turned around and charged the soldiers. Meanwhile, Marius and Diyanah were making short work of the were-rats. They had already dropped 2 of them when Marius realized the phantom leopard required some powerful magic items to damage. He left Diyanah to battle the remaining lycanthropes and entered into the dwarf's room to settle the score with the phantom leopard. Marius dissipated the phantom around the same time that Diyanah finished dispatching the were-rats, but behind them Raja had gotten overwhelmed. With sword and spear and arrow, the traitorous soldiers stationed in the barracks had cut Raja down, the poor lion's blood making the floor slick as they strode towards Marius and Diyanah. Unfortunately, they were too few in number. Between the magical support and crossbow bolts coming from further down the hall, Marius and Diyanah overwhelmed the soldiers. Diyanah raced over to Raja and checked the lion's heartbeat. It was beating still, but only softly. The lion was on death's door. Demi raced over and drew a wand of curing, exhausting almost the entire thing just to get Raja back up on his feet. "We can't go in all half-cocked without a plan anymore," said Diyanah. Aurelius simply raised an eyebrow at the monk. "I mean, things are different now," explained the monk. "I have Raja to look after." "All right," said Demi. "We'll be more careful. That goes for you too, though." The party took a quick moment to make sure there were no survivors to sound alarms. The double bunks and footlockers in the barracks to the north made its purpose clear. The dwarf's room had been an alchemy lab, the long stone chamber containing several low tables, crates of equipment, and barrels of odd-smelling liquids. Beakers of bubbling liquids and translucent balloons of multicolored glass were scattered across the tables. Finally, the were-rats had clearly been jailers, sent to guard over a small jailhouse. Their square room had a musty, unpleasant, rat-like smell. A scarred wooden table surrounded by wooden chairs was in the center of the room, and it looked as though they had been drinking and playing a game of cards there. 2 10-foot by 10-foot prison cells were there as well, and one of them was occupied by a disheveled-looking woman that looked like she hadn't eaten in days. She looked up and saw Marius as he came in, and immediately said, "Help me, please." Then she did a double-take and said, "Marius? Martella's ally Marius? Right, it's me!" The woman appeared to peel her face off, and then standing before them was the lion blade that had assisted them during the Exaltation Day massacre. It was none other than Katheer Zalar. Marius paused at the door, as if expecting it might be some trick. Katheer recognized this, and she added, "Don't you think if the enemy wanted to trick you, they wouldn't leave someone in a dank prison cell indefinitely, waiting for you to show up? The disguise was for them, not for you." Demi stepped into the room. She had grabbed a set of keys from the largest of the 4 were-rats. "Let's get you out of here," she said, sliding the keys in the lock and opening the cell with a soft click. "Tell us everything." "Where to begin?" she said. "I was passing through Yanmass on another mission, and started to hear about this Church of Twilight. I figured before I left I should seek some preliminary information about them to report back to my superiors at the Kitherodian office in Opara. I managed to figure out the cult is one of the operations run by a broader organization that calls itself the Immaculate Circle, though beyond a name I don't really know anything about them. I also know that the Twilight cult's mission was to resurrect Prince Carius, and that they have an expert in this kind of magic on the job. His name is Vadragan Pole, and he's also the cult leader here. Unfortunately, they found me snooping around the encircling Bower Theatre. They captured me and imprisoned me. I've insisted I am nothing more than a too curious local girl, but Vadragan isn't quite believing my protestations. 2 days ago, Vadragan finally completed his task, and he resurrected Prince Carius, or the Twilight Child, as he calls him. I've only seen him in passing, but he does look like Carius, albeit aged up a few years since I last saw him." From this remark, Demi gathered that Katheer was a fair bit older than she presented herself. She also realized why Vadragan was so important to Panavar Lothide. Panavar was a master arcanist, but one needed divine or occult power to perform a resurrection of this nature. Vadragan must have been Panavar's expert in resurrections. Aurelius nodded at Katheer. "That connects a few dots for us. We thought we'd have to seek out the cult at the encircling Bower Theatre, but it appears the cult has already moved on. Looks like, one way or another, our path leads us to Vadragan. Do you know where he and the resurrected Carius are?" "I do, actually," she said. "There's a room, not far from the prison, that is Vadragan's bedroom here. You may wish to have a look around there, but I suspect it'll be empty right now, as I haven't heard him come by. We're very close to the fruition of his plans. Pytherius arrives tomorrow to collect the child, so he's staying up all night and watching over Carius personally. This dungeon predates the cult. It was built by whomever built the caravanserai, so they're just repurposing it. At the end of the hall is a second set of stairs, and it leads down into what can only be described as a makeshift throne room. If his control of the cult hadn't already gone to his head, the throne room, I'm sure, has made Vadragan's ego even bigger. He's undoubtedly there, seated on the old throne, biding his time until Pytherius arrives in the morning." "Then that's where we finish this," said Diyanah confidently. Before they moved on to the throne room, however, they did take time to scope out Vadragan's private quarters. Though the room was small, the bed was luxurious. A round writing desk and chair were next to the bed. The desk contained only a few sheets of plain paper, writing implements, a lump of red wax, and a metal seal with a symbol of overlapping circles. 2 books sat on Vadragan's desk, a handwritten book of notes entitled Diverting the River of Souls, which included a mix of theological musings on the nature of life, as well as arcane scribbles related to the overlap between resurrection magic and summoning spells. The second book contained some of the first book's arcane notations in a new handwriting, surmising towards the end of the notations that someone already blooded by the Beyond could usurp mortal worship and channel it into himself. Perhaps this was something Vadragan was doing with the Twilight cult to acquire additional power. Aurelius was not well versed enough in these methods to interpret them, but he pocketed the 2 books anyway. He might be able to make use of them someday in the future, perhaps. Finally, they followed the long hallway north. A heavy wooden door with a lever and arrow slits, just like the one they had encountered on their way in, could be opened, and led to where the closed portcullis partitioned the landing. On the left, at the end of the hall, a flight of stairs veered off down towards where the throne room was. Before they approached Vadragan's final lair, the party pulled together a quick plan. Aurelius had prepared a seeming spell, which allowed him to disguise any number of creatures. Aurelius's illusions were masterful, and he believed that he could trick even Vadragan's keen eyes. For the seeming spell, he made everyone appear to be a member of the Twilight cult, in blue robes, just as the cultists had been robed in the chapel, or as cult soldiers, armed with bows, as the archers had been behind the arrow slits. Then they rushed into Vadrigan's throne room together, crying out that intruders had infiltrated the dungeon, and that they were headed for the throne room. Aurelius's illusions proved as efficacious as ever. "Ready yourselves for a fight, then," cried out Vadrigan. "Barricade the doors, turn over the tables, and seek cover. We will repel them here." For a moment the party scattered, following the instructions to the letter and using it as an opportunity to assess the power of their foes. Vadrigan sat on an ornate throne of brass and ivory that the caravanserai's builders had left behind here. Flanking him on either side were two more dwarven mantis-style monks of Raumia. Scattered throughout the room were additional henchmen, two sorceress cult acolytes of the same type they had encountered in the chapel, 4 rangers wearing robes and carrying longbows of the type they had encountered in the hall. Compartmentalized from the rest of the room there was also a prison, and in that prison was young Marius, looking fearfully at a prison guardian. That guardian, another Sakil, of the same horrific cockroach breed that they had encountered in the slaughterhouse. Demi knew that any moment things would turn violent, so she began to set themselves up for the advantage. She encouraged the 4 soldiers to come close to her, under the guise of having to move one of the tables together. It was around this time that Vadrigan noticed one of the cultists that had entered the room. One which Diyanah was leading awkwardly by the hand seemed to be behaving a little strangely, sniffing the air and licking his face. Vadrigan began to cast a detect magic spell, but Aurelius preempted him. "Now!" he shouted, and he cast a haste spell on the party. The warrior that had been licking himself suddenly turned into a mighty lion, and Diyanah jumped onto his back. "Hi-ya!" cried Diyanah. "Get the Sakil, Raja!" Diyanah, riding his trusty lion, rushed forward to do battle with the horrific monstrosity. Demi was glad she had pushed the warriors together. "Monkey time," she said, loving this new spell she had started to use. The 4 rangers scrambled with horror as dozens of screeching monkeys fell on them from the sky. The 2 sorceress cultists looked ready to clobber Demi and Aurelius with magical attacks, when suddenly Katheer Zalar appeared, stabbing a pointed rapier right through the back of one of the sorcerers. The dwarves leapt forward towards her, but Marius was faster, interceding and delivering a chopping blow with Coriana's blade at one of the 2 dwarves. As they went in to sweep him, Marius reacted, learning from his previous encounter, and jumped up to avoid the sweep. "Garrus," cried Vadrigan, "it's time for our final contingency protocol. You must fetch the Placid One." One of the 2 dwarves used its Way of the Abundant Step, and it vanished from the fight. Vadrigan needed to turn the tide. He went to cast a Dominate Person spell on Marius, who was overpowering his remaining monk. One of the gems gleamed on Marius's relic weapon, though, and it countered the spell. The other sorcerer went to cast a lightning bolt spell, but Aurelius countered it with a ready dispel magic. Then Katheer was on him, stabbing at him with her bloodied rapier. The attack forced him to take a few steps back, giving Demi her opening. She put a crossbow bolt directly into his heart. He was dead before he hit the floor. The 4 rangers were rolling around on the floor covered in monkeys. It looked like it would be a minute before they could properly rejoin the fight, but just for good measure, she blasted them with a glitter dust spell as well. Meanwhile, Marius was struggling with the dwarven monk. The monk had taken an entirely defensive posture and was deflecting every punch Marius made. "Ignore him," said Aurelius. "He's fighting defensively as a delaying tactic. Go for Vadrigan." Aurelius also focused his attention on countering whatever spells Vadrigan might sling their way. Marius disengaged and went for Vadrigan as well. Katheer followed. Demi took one more glance at the blinded monkey-covered rangers and then also aimed her weapon at Vadrigan. Meanwhile, Diyanah was loving this battle from the back of the lion. The 2 had become a perfect fighting pair, and the Sakil was suffering under their barrage of attacks. In previous fights, the Sakils had fled into the ethereal plane before succumbing to death. But here, so close to the Twilight Child, this Sakil must have been under different orders, and it fought to the death, continuing to lash out at Diyanah and Raja until it was a broken, twitching pile of bloody carapace. Diyanah hopped off the lion and looked at Prince Marius dead in the eyes. "What are you?" said Diyanah. "I'm just me," he said, "and I want you to know, Diyanah, that I remember things. Almost everything, in fact, from my time locked away in your body. And I want you to know that I'm sorry. I'm truly, genuinely sorry for all the pain that I've caused you over the years. I know I was just pain and anger and fear, and I know I put all of that into you, and that's all I can say. I'm not evil." "And what if I'm not convinced?" "Well then," said Prince Marius, and he did a perfectly poised imitation of Diyanah's dragon-style stance, "just know that I don't want to die, and I will defend myself." "Well, it's your lucky day, kid," said Diyanah, kicking open the prison cell door, "because I've been told to bring you back alive, and I may not agree with it, but that's what I'm going to do. Come on." Diyanah jumped onto Raja, and Marius, hesitant at first, jumped onto the back of Raja as well. The dire line came out into the main room just as things were concluding there. Demi had put 2 bolts into Vadrigan's chest, Katheer had stabbed him in the stomach, and Marius finally smashed his face in with Coriana's blade. Vadrigan appeared to die. But then, just as suddenly as he expired, Vadrigan's entire body seemed to turn to black mist, and with the hissing sound of air escaping, his essence was absorbed into a wicked-looking black knife that dropped dramatically to the table. The dwarf monk grabbed it, and then activated its abundant step. It disappeared. Aurelius snarled in anger. This Vadrigan was full of contingencies. He wasn't letting them get away. He was out of magic himself, but Demi and Marius could kill the dwarf in no time. He reached into his pack and threw Demi a scroll of dimension door. "Demi, grab Marius and teleport as far east as you can. I think that knife is Vadrigan's soul. The monk will be trying to take Vadrigan to Pytherius." Demi caught the scroll in midair and ran towards Marius, unfurling the scroll and reading the words of arcane power as she ran. "Let's go, big guy." In a flash they were gone. Then the door opened. It was the second monk, fists bared, ready to throw down. Katheer threw a dagger at him in the doorway, and the monk caught it and gave her an angry look, and leapt forward towards her with a flying kick. Behind the monk was the yellow-robed figure with the nasty face, the placid one. It looked intently at Diyanah standing up on the lion. "I thought I had suggested that you simply leave," he said in a lilting voice. "Perhaps I should have been more specific. You have something I desire." Diyanah suddenly felt a great surge of energy from the ruby in his pocket. His eyes went a bright red, and before he knew it, his thoughts were not his own. He turned around on the lion and grabbed Prince Marius, and threw him headlong so that he landed sprawling before the placid one. "No, Diyanah!" cried Aurelius. "What are you doing?" "Thank you," said the placid one. "I have all I need now." The placid one leaned over the boy and placed a hand on his neck. With a terrible shimmering, the creature moved out of reality. This was not a teleportation effect like a dimension door. Rather, it was closer to what the Sackils appear to do when they move between the material and ethereal plane. The placid one had taken Prince Marius back to its own plane. Diyanah's eyes suddenly went back to normal. "What the hell just happened?" Diyanah asked Aurelius. "Did we just lose?" Aurelius was just pacing and cursing. "Let me think, Diyanah. There's got to be a way." Diyanah came up with a plan before Aurelius could think of one. "Aurelius," he said, "we have to call Zan. He's the only one that can help us now." Aurelius fished through his pack for a scroll of sending. Outside the caravanserai, Demi and Marius chased the last monk. The monk's supernatural chi made it faster than any dwarf should be, but Demi and Marius were still under the effects of Aurelius's haste spell. They closed with him after a short chase, and Demi shot him in the back as Marius tackled him to the ground. Another punch later, and the monk was no more. The black dagger in his hand released. "What do you make of this?" said Marius, handing the weapon over to Demi. "It's powerful," she said. "Another relic. If someone dies while holding this, it will preserve the soul, preventing it from escaping to the boneyard, and guaranteeing a resurrection will be successful. That said, if someone understands the dagger and holds it, they can release any soul bound within." She held the dagger as she said this, and with a strange cry, the black mist that was bound in the dagger dispersed, rising up into the air. Vadrigan's twitching corpse suddenly appeared before them as well, which was convenient, as there was plenty of good stuff for Marius to pick off the body, like talismans of power, a strong ring of protection, and a headband of charisma. "Hope you enjoy your afterlife," said Demi to the released spirit as it dissipated. "But something tells me you're going to one of the nasty places." As Demi and Marius stood there, looking over the body of Vadrigan Paul, they were suddenly startled by a swirling swarm of crows, and suddenly the tall, emaciated figure of Zan was stood before them. "Come," he commanded. "I have been called." Zan flew towards the caravanserai, his wings spread out like a great black crow in flight. Demi and Marius were able to keep up, but frankly only because of Aurelius's haste spell. As it flew towards the caravanserai, at first the archers mounted on the wall started to shoot at it, but their weapons had no effect against the formidable extraplanar creature. As it got even closer and they could see it, the deathly fear that radiated off of Zan broke their nerves and they fled from the battlements. Demi and Marius raced up the steps and followed Zan into the building. Where soldiers stood against them, he cut through them with his mighty scythe. Most fled in terror. Zan made a beeline for the dungeon stairs under the onion dome, and Demi and Marius followed him. He shattered the portcullis that separated them from the throne room and then flew down the tunnel, to land where Aurelius, Katheer, and Diyanah were gathered. Demi and Marius, now panting, were not far behind. "Where's Marius?" asked Demi. "We lost him," said Aurelius. "The Placid One took him to some other plane."
"That is the least of your worries," said Zan suddenly. "I have done as you have asked. I have investigated how this Panavar Luthid was able to hide from us, and I have learned some terrible things I must now tell you. Panavar is allied with a great enemy of mine, and he is called Thasritum, the Mewling Storm. Thasritum was once one of the Yamaraj, the highest order of psychopomps, and a being I had once looked up to, but he became one of the most dread and feared Sakil lords of all. My history with him is personal."
Zan unhooked the red and gold plague mask he always wore, revealing the crow's skull underneath that passed for his head. Upon it, 3 terrible claw marks were clearly visible.
"Despite my powerful nature as a post-mortal being, this wound will never heal. A terrible reminder of the battle we had before his final corruption. Now it seems our paths have crossed yet again. It is Thasritum that has helped spirit Panavar's soul to a private demiplane, and from there he hides from us. This is how he has evaded death all these years. To find him, though, we will need the aid of an expert, and we won't find that expert here."
Then he placed his great scythe before the party and said,
"So grip my staff and I will ferry you away from this place, because to win this war you'll need more than you can find in this land of mortals."
Aurelius turned to Katheer. "You cannot go with us. Someone needs to stay behind and explain all this madness to the Grand Duke. Please apologize to him for our failure. We didn't mean to break our promise. We really tried our best." Then he gripped the staff. In turn, so did Demi, and then so did Marius, and then Diyanah told Raja to put his paw in before gripping the staff himself. Magical crows seemed to engulf them, and to the sound of 100 beating wings they were torn from out of the material plane, to distant realms beyond. End of chapter. Thank you so much for watching. What a crazy episode. All right, we have finished. We have finished book 3 of my War for the Crown series. This was an interesting episode and obviously very, very different from the way that I suspect most of these book 3 games will end, because obviously my party didn't go to the Encircling Bower Theater. Instead, what I did was I took all of the villains and NPCs and characters from the Encircling Bower Theater and I moved them to the Caravanserai. See, the world is a living world, and the villains don't have to just sit at their assigned dungeon forever. They can move around, and it sort of made sense to me that as things were coming to a head, and as Vadrigan was pretty, well informed as to what the heroes were up to, and he'd also lost. Don't forget, he'd failed to recapture their witnesses. So I think he knew that Broyce Ranjana was going to head to the Tall Grasses Caravanserai. I knew that I wanted to have a final showdown there. So in order to make that work, I actually added a whole other dungeon beneath the Caravanserai that doesn't exist there in the books. That's fine, the world is malleable in that way. They had never been into the Tall Grasses Caravanserai, so they had no way of knowing that there was in fact no dungeon under the Caravanserai. That was a fabrication of mine. But it worked really well. So ultimately the Encircling Bower never entered into my adventure. Instead, all of the villains, which includes the Placid One, it includes the monks, it includes the cult of the Twilight Child, which is basically a kind of a splinter cell, I guess, of the Immaculate Circle. All of those characters, those villains, even the Dwarf Alchemist and the Animate Dream that she's got, all those villains that appear in that dungeon, in the Encircling Bower dungeon, were remixed and re-put together as villains in the Caravanserai. Then I also had the difficult question of how I was going to handle the fact that, well, I have a whole army that Broyce Ranjana has, and I have a whole army that Commander Jaliesa Stobel has. And ultimately what this came down to is I was going to make sure that events would play out so that Grand Duke Diyanah wasn't actually going to attack the caravanserai. And the way that I did that was that I was going to have Commander Jaliessa Stobel get out on her Drake, go out in front of, meet with the Grand Duke and let him know that she had Prince Carius. And I also knew that because Grand Duke Diyanah was a traditionalist, that his reaction to that would be first anger at the players for not having been completely honest with him about what was going on in town, because it was clear they knew. And second, that he wasn't going to jeopardize the life of someone that he thought maybe could bring unity to Taldor. And I'm always eternally grateful for my players for basically doing my work for me. I think once it was clear that there wasn't going to be a big military conflict between the two, it was my players that proposed, hey, let's go in and do a stealth mission and try to retrieve Carius. And then finally I thought, here we are back in line with kind of what the adventure path wants us to do, which is to rescue Carius. Up until now, I think they were quite happy with Zan disposing of Carius. But here, with the promise made to the Grand Duke Broyce, they suddenly were going to try and rescue Carius in line with what the adventure actually wants them to do. And then we had this really fun and fairly intense dungeon crawl through the dungeon beneath the caravanserai, and they encounter the Placid One. Diyanah picks up the red gem. I love how the player that plays Diyanah just basically embraces every bad decision. So as soon as he took the red gem, now in the adventure path, the red gem is a misdirect. I don't even know really why it's there, because it doesn't add a lot of value from a story standpoint, but he gives this red gem in exchange for being left alone, and the red gem is basically valueless. It's like an illusion. It's not really there. And I was like, what a waste. What a waste of a cool moment. And so I knew that I wanted the red gem to pay off, and the fact that they decided not to attack the Placid One, I knew that I wanted that to pay off. And then as they went through the dungeon, they encounter a member of the Lion's Blade. Here's another small change. The Lion Blade in question is actually not Cathan's Alar in the book as written. It's actually one of Cathan's friends. And later in book 4, the friend re-meets with Cathan, and the heroes have a reunion with Cathan, and Cathan's like too important for this particular event. I just wanted to have a character in the prison that the players would recognize. And so my players started interrogating Cathan and asking her what she knew about what was happening with the cult of the Twilight Child, and what their plans might be, and if they had any mitigation strategies to get Carius out of there. And I think the things that we're looking for in particular was who can cast Dimension Door, who can cast Teleport, who can cast any other spell that would get Carius out of there that they needed to be aware of. And I think she is the first one to call out that the Placid One can plane shift, and that she knows that he's there as kind of for some kind of emergency situation. So in a weird way, it was the players' questioning of how they might get Carius out that ultimately seeded the idea that that's why the Placid One was there. In the book, the Placid One is actually there to do a deal and acquire the knife that we see the players pick up at the end of this. I ultimately decided it was more fun if the knife was in Vadrigan's possession. That way, when he died, he didn't actually die, and he had a chance to be resurrected, especially since the monks had Abundant Step and could actually teleport out of there. So an Abundant Step does not permit you actually to grab Carius. So really the only one that had the ability of getting Carius out of there was the Placid One. All of that, these elements kind of added up to this final encounter with Vadrigan Pole, the actual battle of which went reasonably well. And then I finally had the opportunity to make that red gem mean something when we had the Placid One approach Aurelius and Diyanah at the end there. He asks for Carius. Diyanah fails his will save. He throws Carius out there, and the Placid One is suddenly gone. and now my player characters don't know what to do, so they decide to call on Zan and get some extraplanar assistance. And this is about the time that I made a pretty critical decision that I definitely know most other players, most other GMs probably have not done with this particular adventure path, and it's basically what comes after book 3. So, in order to talk about this, I have to talk about the structure of the adventure path overall, which is essentially book 1 you're all familiar with, book 2 is Marat, book 3 is Yanmass, book 4 you actually deal with Strategos Pytherius. So he actually, theoretically, gets defeated 2/3 of the way through the adventure path. This, I think, frankly, it always kind of sat slightly ill with me that, this guy that we'd set up as kind of the big bad in book 1 actually gets dealt with at the end of book 4, and then Panevar Lothid kind of becomes the villain for the next 2 books. And I thought, well, what happens next in the adventure path? Well, book 6 is a return to Taldor. Book 5, the player characters go off to extraplanar realms to deal with stuff in the great beyond. That is kind of, book 5 is a really a fun romp through like a completely different part of the universe, of the Pathfinder universe. And it occurred to me that I wanted to swap books 4 and books 5. So instead of going into the City in the Lion's Eye as my chapter 4, we're going to go right into the Reaper's Right Hand in chapter 4, and we're going to come back to the City in the Lion's Eye in part 5. I'll talk a little bit more about the modifications I made to make that possible, but essentially my idea is, you think of it as a scouring of the Shire idea, right? Sam and Frodo go to Mount Doom. They have all these crazy adventures. They come back, and now they're great heroes, and they can deal with the scouring of the Shire. I want to do something similar here. Our heroes go to the great beyond. They have some crazy adventures. They come back to the relatively normal Taldor, and they still have to deal with Pytherius. So I knew that I was going to have to probably reduce the difficulty a little bit on the book 5 encounters and increase the difficulty on the book 4 encounters. But I thought I can make this work, and I think narratively this was really going to work for my campaign. Anyway, I've talked a lot. This was a fun episode. I hope you all enjoyed it. Season 4 of War for the Crown will be coming at you very soon. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.